Thank you for joining us. This is a re-recording of our original webinar. I am Dr. Kay Kotis, a prairie ecologist, botanist, horticulturist, and former instructor of North American native plants, horticulture, and botany at UNL and Nebraska Wesleyan Universities. As president of Prairie Legacy, Inc., I travel the state doing environmental surveys and providing restoration consulting. I am the chair of Nebraska Seed and Plant Producers, an organization created to support and increase knowledge of and availability of local ecotype plant material in Nebraska. In 2010, I purchased the family farm, founded Wits End Homestead, and began to transition the 160-year-old traditional farm to produce local ecotype seed and plant materials. Prairie Legacy makes these available online. Today my home is on the prairie, and my goal is helping others to restore, preserve, and understand the prairie in new ways. This series of webinars is put together to provide a guide for people interested in creating new and enhancing old tallgrass prairie habitat, either over several acres or just a few square feet. In this first segment, we are discussing the planning and preparation phase of your habitat project. We will be demonstrating these principles at Lucky Dog Acres so you can get a bird's eye view of an actual project. AJ Fulbright and her husband own Lucky Dog Acres, and they welcome visitors who are interested in learning about their project. This first slide shows a picture of a CRP pollinator planting established with seed from Prairie Legacy. It was taken 3 years after planting. CRP is the Conservation Reserve Program. The NRCS offers this and several other programs to help landowners enhance their land with native plantings. If you have a large project of 2 or more acres, you may be eligible for some of the land enhancement programs offered through the NRCS. You should consult the local FSA agent if you think you might qualify. This mix was specified to be 22 seeds per square foot with only 25% grasses. I encourage the landowner to double the seeding rate to give him adequate coverage. See if you can spot what's missing in this photo. There is only one grass plant here, as you can see my cursor circling it. The matrix of this mix is really Coreopsis tinctoria. The specified mix contained only short grasses and only 25% at that. It's not really representative of tallgrass prairie. The Coreopsis will fade over time even though it does reseed itself. It remains to be seen whether or not the grasses will fill in its place. Your project, whether it's a small urban patch of prairie habitat for pollinators or an entire section of land or more, is very important for the tallgrass prairie ecosystem. Tallgrass prairie is the most imperiled ecosystem in North America and the least protected ecosystem on Earth. If you follow the science of climate change, you know that within the next 60 years we're likely to see large-scale desertification, the degradation and loss of topsoil for effective food production, along with many other effects of an unstable climate. The young man in this photo will see millions of people displaced as homeless as a result. You may understand fully that ecosystems are complex interactions of organisms that work and cooperate together to function effectively. Most people don't understand how very much we humans rely on these ecosystems for every aspect of our lives. And further, we fail to see how different ecosystems function together to make the Earth function properly. What happens in the tallgrass prairie ecosystem affects oceans and vice versa. It is the biodiversity of Earth and each ecosystem on it that provides for a stable climate. By paving over and plowing up all but 1% of our tallgrass prairie, we have upset that balance, and our best course now is to return as much biodiversity as we can to the ecosystem of which we are a part. Every contribution you can make to that end, no matter how small, will help us avoid widespread desertification, stabilize the soil and return soil health. It will provide habitat for pollinators and other animals dependent upon it. It will help provide clean water and prevent runoff and so many other benefits, too many to mention here. But we must do this right. Remember that we're protecting an entire ecosystem, not just one species. If your goal is protecting bees or pollinators, that is wonderful. but do it from the perspective of protecting tallgrass prairie ecosystem for the pollinators. To focus on one species or one group of species alone runs the risk of doing so at the expense of many other components of that ecosystem. Lastly, you should understand that creatures of our tallgrass prairie ecosystem now live in the concrete jungle with us out of necessity. In order for many of them to survive, components of tallgrass must also be in that same urban setting. For instance, if you're familiar with Doug Tallamy, you may know that he had a graduate student who discovered that chickadees require 30% local ecotype plant material in order for their populations to persist in an urban setting. They must have that matrix of species to support the particular insects that they feed to their young. If you're in an urban setting, this is the type of thing that you can be your contribution. There are many questions to consider when you plan your project. What's the proximity to the roadway or your neighbors? That's going to help determine the height and how you maintain it. What's the size of your area, which helps determine the planting method? Every site has issues. What's there now? If you have a rare orchid on site, you probably don't want to spray it as a preparation. What's the access to equipment? Can equipment be brought on site? Do you have a sunny area, shady area? What's the moisture regime there? Is it irrigated or dry? What sort of soil do you have? Is it loamy or sand or clay? That helps determine what your seed mix is. What sort of disturbances have occurred there? Has there been chemicals applied? All of these things have to do with the preparation and timing. What's your timeline and your patience level? And what's your budget? Seed mixes can cost anywhere from $75 an acre to several $1,000s per acre. And what's the purpose of your planting? Are you doing this for cattle, for horse pasture, or are you doing this as a pollinator planting? Any of those things, you also have to consider the right perspective. And by that I mean you're restoring tallgrass prairie for pollinators or for birds or for cattle, and not the other way around. And maintenance depends on all of the above. So what is the current state of your particular plot? Is it cultivated ground, an open field? Is it native prairie but has been invaded by one species or another? Is it completely brome or is it completely turf? All of those things have to be considered when you start your preparation. These two fields, the one on the left and the right, are both remnant prairies, and they each have different issues. The one on the left has been totally invaded by brome and by red clover. The one on the right is heavily grazed and is now a big field of annual ragweed. Each of these will have different preparations. The current state of your site will determine the preparation method involved before you do your seeding. A cultivated or open field or a garden has less preparation than other sites. What you do need to do is consider whether or not a residual herbicide has been applied. A soybean field may have residual herbicides that have a residual of 3 months to 3 years. So it's important to know what has been applied in recent months. If you have no residual herbicide applied, then you can go ahead and drill or broadcast seed in November through January, which is the best time to plant. You can also plant in spring, but you have to consider that seeds of forbs will need a cold, moist stratification period, and so they are likely to sit on the ground and be the subject of herbivores such as birds, insects, and things like that until they get that cold, moist stratification the following winter. So November through January is really the best time to drill or broadcast. If you're putting in plants, August through September or early May are the best times to plant. If in fact you did have a residual herbicide applied, then what you need to do is consider doing another crop the following spring without applying a residual herbicide, and continue that rotation until the residual has been decreased. I mentioned drill or broadcast as methods for seeding, and so I wanted to show you, this is a photograph of a drill. A drill actually doesn't drill holes into the ground. What it does is it cuts through the ground and drops seed in. This particular drill, if you can see, has 3 seed boxes. This first one is a larger seed box, generally used for crop seed like corn or soybeans. It has a middle box here, which is generally used for grass seed and has an auger in it that helps push that fluffy grass seed through it. And very back at end over here is a small seed box used generally for small seeded forbs and things like alfalfa. This is the back side of the drill, and here you see the tubes where the seed drops down, and these coulters here are cutting into the ground and the seed drops between those 2 coulters. Then this wheel presses that seed into the ground to get good seed soil contact. This, however, is the least fancy of the planting equipment. You can just mix your seed in a bucket and toss it out by hand. If your site is a native prairie that's been invaded by brome or another species, or if it is a pure stand brome, you have a more complex preparation to do and many more choices. Ideally, the longer you spend on preparation, the better will be your end results. The 2 most common measures used on these types of fields are herbicide applications and or burning. If you're adverse to using herbicide, there is a precedence for burning in the spring of every year for as much as 10 to 15 years to reduce brome. Heavy seeding is also applied in this case. If you don't have that kind of patience or are restricted in burning, you have 2 choices: herbicide or plowing up the prairie. The disadvantages to plowing are that it reduces the soil organic matter, dries out the soil, releases carbon dioxide, and restricts your planting method to broadcasting. Drilling does not work in loose soil. The disadvantage to herbicide is self-explanatory. This slide shows the method for using herbicide. Follow the middle of the decision tree for as long as you can. If you start in March, then spray in March, again spray in October, and again the following October, if you can. If there's a large amount of dead plant material from the prior year and you cannot burn the field, then mowing it, waiting a couple of weeks before spraying, will help reveal enough of the green brome to get a good contact with the spray herbicide. The timing of the spraying is important if your field is at least partially native. Spraying in March, when the brome is actively growing, is less likely to be detrimental to warm season native plants that start growing later. As a cool season grass, it will also be actively growing in late October after other species have died back. This is the very best time to spray. So if you spray only once, October is the time to do it. If your field has no native component, then the timing of herbicide application is less important. I suggest mowing in June on this slide so that you can remove the flowering heads of the brome to keep it from reseeding during this process. Burning is also helpful if that is possible for you. If you do have a native component to your prairie, you may be surprised at what you see after a burn. So if the smooth brome component is not overwhelming, burning may be all that you want to do. Brome will return if left unburned, however. In this decision tree, there are several places where one could move out of the preparation phase and plant. However, the longer you spend in the middle of this tree in the preparation phase, the better your results. If your site is an existing prairie or grassland and you want to enhance it by introducing additional forbs, your goal will be to inhibit the grasses slightly to reduce some competition while they establish themselves. We talked about using frequent burns if your prairie is invaded by brome. A burn in the early spring will help open up the areas between the grasses that are established so that you can get better seed soil contact. It may also, though, serve to dry out the soil a bit. So you need to be careful if you're broadcasting. It's easier to get good seed soil contact if you can get a drill on site. If you cannot, you can still broadcast, but you will get better soil contact if you can disturb the soil in some way or burn. We've also experimented with putting plants into the prairie in smaller areas. We simply put a spade into the ground, open it up, shove the plant's roots in there in that slit in the ground, and then press the soil around it and water it well. We don't have results yet from some of those experiments, but if you're interested, I can let you know how that turns out. This slide just shows an example of a prescribed burn on one of my prairies. I mentioned that burning opens up the spaces between the grass. You don't have the dead litter lying on the ground, and so in this slide you can see, even though this is an established prairie, there are a lot of spaces in between these grass plants, this darker area. If your project is removing turf, you have several options. You can use an herbicide in March or October, then rake and broadcast, or use a drill if you have a large area. You can drill in April or November to January, or broadcast in April or November to January. You'd want to put plants in the ground in May or early September. You could also strip the turf. You can do that in spring or fall, then broadcast in April or November to January, or put plants in May or early September. Your other option is to solarize or smother the turf in the summertime. You would do that in the warmer months, starting in late May, June, July, and August. We'll cover solarization in the next webinar. You can then put plants in September, or you can seed January through November. Solarization is the use of clear plastic to basically cook the turf. Smothering the turf is done by reducing its ability to get light, and we will cover both of those options in our next webinar. Just a small reminder to those in urban landscapes that a native landscape doesn't have to look wild. It can be arranged and still be an effective ecosystem. This is an aerial view of Lucky Dog Acres. This is where we will be demonstrating our prairie recreation. We'll also have a small area which we will seed early in April with our Prairie Pronto mix. So this will be a small pollinator planting. This is another view of Lucky Dog Acres. You can see the south edge here, and you can see that there is a shaded area that we will have to deal with. We had to analyze several issues at Lucky Dog Acres. We have the shade on the south side that I mentioned earlier. We have a burn pile in the middle of our area. There's smooth brome to contend with over most of the area. The neighbor has eastern red cedar trees on the south. AJ has mulberry trees that they've elected to keep even though they're not native because they do like the mulberries. One thing we're going to do here is we're going to have a mowed path around the edge. We're dealing with the fact that this is in a suburban area where there are neighbors on either side and burning is not possible. However, with the tallgrass prairie, we do have to be careful for accidental burns, particularly if we're going to have a burn pile there at some point. So we're going to make sure the outside edge can be mowed, and we're also going to include on the lower right a bee lawn, which is a very short tallgrass prairie planting around what will be a new burn pile. So this shows where the burn break is and the bee lawn. The total area is about 2.4 acres, and we'll probably have about a quarter acre of bee lawn around the burn pile. This is what we're doing to prepare Lucky Dog Acres. It's pretty much a brome field. We assessed the vegetation some time ago and the potential problems. It has mostly smooth brome and very few forbs. We had to plan for the removal of some of the problems, such as the burn pile. And if it's not possible to remove some problems, such as the neighbor's cedars, we have to make contingency plans. So the cedar trees on the border will be contended with by having a large mow line or burn break in the potential that a burn could happen. In order to site prep, in early March, we mowed the brome, and we will spray in a couple of weeks when the brome is green enough, and then we'll decide on a seed mix and get that ordered. When you choose your seed mix, there are several things you have to consider. You need to consider the soil, the type of sun, the height that you may be contending with, and the cost. Any type of seed mix can be made into a budget-friendly mix. So there are lots of ways that we can do custom mixes. A higher percent of grasses is a lower cost than a higher percent of forbs. You need to consider the purpose of your seed mix, and remember that you are producing tallgrass prairie habitat, and it may be for the purpose of pollinators or birds or some other reason, but initially it is for tallgrass prairie habitat for those things. Maintenance is also an issue that you need to consider. Are you going to be able to mow it, burn it, or graze it? And what height do you need your mix to be? Here are some things to avoid. When you are preparing your site, don't get in a hurry. Do it right. When you're planting this habitat, you're planting not for a single species, you're planting an entire habitat. Don't include invasive or exotic species in a mix just because the mix is cheaper. Here's some examples. White, alsike, yellow, and red clovers are a big no-no. Take a look at this field in this photograph. That's yellow sweet clover. I walked through miles and miles and miles of yellow sweet clover in South Dakota. These were planted for pollinator habitat for bees. This yellow sweet clover, white clover, red clover are all European species that tend to invade native prairies and crowd out the native species. Do not plant them under any circumstances in your prairie or near a prairie. They will invade. Many or most mixes have exotic species in them, so be careful. Don't buy a mix that does not list the species that are within it. You should probably plant at least 40 seeds per square foot. The more, the better. And don't buy a mix just based on the weight. What I mean by that is, if you're buying a mix with several different species, you need to know how many seeds you're going to have per square foot. Just going based on the weight won't tell you very much, because different species are different sizes and therefore have very different weights. So partridge pea, for instance, has approximately 65,000 seeds per pound. But yarrow has over 3 million seeds per pound. So it's important to know how many seeds per square foot you're actually getting in your mix. Here's an example of a seed mix sold in Lincoln, a locally sold mix. This one is a European native, not native to North America. Another European native. Another European species. A North American species, but not native to this area. Another North American species not native to this area. Another European species, actually from China. Another European species, another non-native North American species, another North American species that's no longer found in Nebraska, another North American species not native here, and yet another European species. So less than half of this mix is actually local seed. Some other things to look for in a seed mix: you can expect it to be from $100 to $2,000 per acre. There's a very wide range here. You should look for no fewer than 40 seeds per square foot and no fewer than 16 species. Now, there's really no hard, fast rule about how many species you need to have in your seed mix. The more diversity, the better. But what we know is that carbon sequestration is improved by every species that you put in your mix. And up to 16 species or so, it starts to taper off at that point. So we recommend at least that many. You should have 0 regional non-native species in your mix. Here's an example of a pollinator seed mix. We found a pollinator seed mix for $120 per acre. It had 22 seeds per square foot, which is really not enough. It had 40 species, which is very good, but only 2 grass species and only 25% of the mix. It's probably best to have a little bit more grasses, at least more species. And it had only 3 non-native Nebraska species in it. Here's an example of a CP2 mix from an NRCS program that was brought to me. It has 4 different types of grasses and 4 different types of legume seeds in it. 3 of those legume seeds are European natives. So what we did for him was we increased the number of species and got rid of all of the non-natives. We were able to do that for $10 less per acre, and we got all natives in this species. So it is possible to adapt a mix to make sure that you don't have the non-native European clovers in it. So what you need for your plan: first of all, if there are some programs that can help you with the cost of this program, you can talk to your local NRCS and FSA offices for some help. You need to know how you will prepare your site, What will your mix be, or will you be planting plugs? How will you plant your mix? What's the equipment you need? And what is going to be your management plan or the future care? Here's what you should expect. You should expect to spend 3 to 18 months in preparation of the site. You should expect that you could do some mowing for the first 2 years for weed control. You do not have to mow, but it will typically take more like 5 years for you to get a good establishment if you don't mow to reduce the weed pressure. You can expect that in 2 to 5 years you will get full appreciation of your prairie and you will have grateful pollinators. And if you can plant as much as a 1/4 acre, at the moment that you can get 4% organic matter, you can expect approximately 400 pounds of carbon sequestration per year for that 1/4 acre. For 5 acres, you could sequester as much as a ton per year. And you can expect a better future for all of us. Thank you for joining us for the first part of our series. Our next webinar will include solarization, seed mixes, seeding rates, and how to plant your seed mix. We will have a demonstration of a hand broadcasting and of solarization. In the meantime, if you have questions about your project or you need to find a seed mix or needed plants, please visit prairielegacyinc.com. And if we can help by consulting with you, we're happy to do that as well. Thanks again, and we'll see you at our next webinar.